Hi everyone, I'm really excited to have Morénike here again. This is a video we've been excited to make for a while. It's basically on autistic men, and to be a little bit more specific, it's on autistic men and gender expectations and mental health. So the first question is that we know that autistic women, as well as some non-binary individuals, face quite a few different challenges like delays in diagnosis, higher rates of pressure sometimes to mask autistic traits. One potential starting question is, are there challenges that autistic men may be more likely to face?
Yes. So I definitely think that there are. And I think that there, I think some of the problem is really about how we conceptualize um, autism in these gendered ways. Some people, I've heard like Dina Gassner and some other people talk about like externalizing versus internalizing as opposed to these ideas, like we know that some researchers have used terms such as extreme male brain and so forth to talk about how autism presents. And I think that some of there's been a lot of information lately, a lot more attention, and I'm glad about like camouflaging and masking. But I think when we consider how some people are socialized in youth, um, it almost kind of lends itself to people who are reared, or typically I guess socialized as a girl, as a young girl, are encouraged to camouflage or mask more in general. I think, and particularly when neurodivergence is at play, whereas it's a little different. I think camouflaging, masking, there's a pressure that is that everyone feels when they're cognizant of it, at some point in age. But I think that um, the having, I guess, less, um, I guess, practice with, you know, like successfully, quote unquote, camouflaging or masking in a way that's, been, kind of like encouraged and developed, by society becomes a disadvantage for autistic, men, for autistic young males, because although the camouflaging can be unhealthy, it is still a survival mechanism. It's still a coping mechanism of sorts. And so, not being as adept at doing so means that you are more likely present in a manner that's more overtly autistic, or neurodivergent, and therefore results in you being perceived differently, potentially more negatively, potentially as more awkward, or, more, stranger, possibly more of a threat or a danger to others.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. I agree completely with what you said. And I also think that there's often a pressure on um, autistic women, for example, or probably women more generally, to not be perceived as too assertive. And I think that sometimes um, the other end of that pressure is that men are often expected to not show weakness or to show vulnerability or even just to show anxiety, which I think can sometimes be perceived as being overly sensitive. And given that autistic people in general are often pretty anxious, I think for good reason, there's a lot of good reasons why we might develop more social anxiety. Um, that I think can sometimes lead to mental health for autistic men being maybe overlooked a little bit more, or viewed as something that needs to be just, where one needs to just kind of quote unquote suck it up and deal with it. Um, and yeah, I definitely agree as well that autistic men may be more likely to be labeled as violent. I think also when you kind of think about the degree of victimization that's often experienced by autistic people, like abuse or domestic violence, I think in general society doesn't always recognize that men can be victims of these experiences as well. So a lot of shelters or services for victims or survivors may not extend their service to men. And that might disproportionately impact men who are also vulnerable in other ways. Yeah, so the second question is, are there cases where autistic traits might be misunderstood as misogynistic?
I think there are, definitely. So, and I know we've kind of had our own conversations about this, um, that are interesting because, so one thing that I think about is it's weird because I feel like, you know how they talk about stereotypes or whatever, take a seed of something, of a generalization that might have some accuracy, and then like really really distort it or apply it too widely, or whatever. Kind of like that idea of kind of taking and twisting and manipulating truth to to where it's no longer necessarily a truth and it's harmful. And I think some of those things exist in um in this instance, like the concept of like mansplaining and manspreading. Those things do exist, you know what I mean? Like there are people who, I'm thinking about a previous coworker some years ago, who was very kind of, you know condescending in this manner. But then I also think about the fact that autistic people are so frequently misunderstood, that it's not unusual for us to think, okay, well, to ensure that I'm clear, let me over explain. Or because we don't like to make assumptions or inferences about what someone does or does not know. We don't want to assume that they, whatever level, base or foundational level of understanding that they have. So we might try to be clear, or, like neutral in terms of like giving the context, or we might be, info dumping because we're excited. And all of those things could be seen as, here you go, mansplaining, blah, 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 And same thing with info dumping, I'm sorry, I mentioned info dumping, but also interrupting. Like when we get excited, like if someone says something and we feel like, oh, okay, I get where they're going with this, like you're kind of seeing a pattern, or it really kind of generates a new thought, you might, and also not having as much experience with like joint interaction and, so forth in the way that the more conventional, ways that non-autistic people communicate, about how many seconds you're supposed to wait in between responding, or when to, like they might be like A, and then the person's supposed to be like B, and then like A and B, and we might be like A, and then the person's like B, and then we might be like A, B, 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 A, B, like it's not the same, and so we might interrupt because we're feeling what the person is saying so much, or it's really interesting and it's not about being rude, or we just didn't realize they were done, they were pausing, or even sometimes our tone of voice, like our tone regulation might be different. So I think a lot of people might perceive those things as being misogynistic when it's really just neurodivergence rearing its head.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, those are great points. And one, I definitely agree, especially the point about interrupting. Sometimes I'm not necessarily encouraging people to go around and interrupt each other all the time, but sometimes it is more of a turn-taking neurodivergent thing rather than something that's rooted in like an inherent disrespect for the other person talking. Another area that comes to mind that I think is also like very complicated is there's a lot of different factors to it, but um, essentially the indirect communication, especially if someone is trying to be friends with someone or set up a relationship with someone who is trying to give subtle hints that they're not that interested. Um, I definitely understand that there are probably a lot of reasons why people, I would imagine disproportionately women, have been trained that they need to be like very polite and let people down very gently. Or maybe people have had experiences before where they reject someone directly and the person handles it terribly, and that can, lead to maybe more indirect communication in the future. But I've also seen situations where autistic people are perfectly happy to accept a rejection, but because the rejections aren't being framed as such, the rejections are maybe coming as like, oh, I'd love to, but I'm busy. Oh, I'd love to, but I'm still busy. They're just like, okay, I'll just keep waiting. I'll just keep asking until the person's not busy. And so I think there are sometimes cases where autistic people, um, and maybe autistic men in particular, just given that I think, um, again, like society's expectations in about men, like often being expected to be the initiators of interactions. I think it can sometimes lead to people being perceived as creepy or overly persistent when in some cases it's just genuinely that things aren't being communicated clearly. But I'd love your thoughts on that as well.
I think that's very true. Like I remember when I was a little kid, I can't remember, there was some movie or show or whatever where some like a guy was calling someone's house, right? And the girl, I guess, didn't want to talk to the guy, or so she would tell the sibling or whoever answered the phone to say, "Tell him I'm washing my hair." So every time the person called, it was like, "Tell him I'm washing my hair." And I started as a child, I started imagining the dude must think she has the cleanest hair in the world, or she, like, how often does she wash her hair? Like every single time I call, she's washing her hair. Like, her hair is going to probably fall out from dryness, like, or something like that. But she was just trying to find a way not to talk to him. And he, kept calling. And so I feel like people, there's a way to reject people politely. Like if someone, let's say an autistic guy, let's say his name is John, is asking out, non-autistic Jane, right? And Jane doesn't have to say, "John, you are ugly, creepy, nasty. I can't stand you. I would never date you in a million years." Like you don't have to say that, right? You can just say, "Oh no, thank you, John. I'm not interested in that way," or "I'd rather not, thank you," or whatever. But instead, "Oh, I don't want to hurt his feelings. So, oh well, I'm so sorry. I'm babysitting that weekend." So then he'll ask you next weekend, "Oh, I'm going out of town with my family this weekend. Oh, I've got a lot of homework." So you keep giving him. So what he's hearing is, "Yes, I would go with you, but I'm busy doing X thing." So in his mind, he's thinking, "Oh, cool. She would go if she wasn't occupied. So I'm going to ask her again." And then I'm going to ask her again. And so if he keeps asking her, she's going to feel like he's harassing her. She's going to feel weirded out because I guess she expects he's going to quote unquote get the hint. No, he's not. We understand no. We don't understand what you just told him isn't no. What you told him is next time. And so I do think that that's the case. The lack of like the indirect communication is a disadvantage for us. And I think that type of thing can also be harmful, not just with like rejection, but thinking about like autistic men, again, like the whole stereotypes of like the male being the initiator. And I know some of that has changed, or it might not even be a situation where the male is, again, could be dating anyone, or, and some of these things apply in friendships or other types of, communication too, like, with colleagues or whatever. But let's look at some of the stereotypes overall. Like there was this big thing on social media not long ago where people were saying, "How dare a guy take me out to eat at the Cheesecake Factory or this place or that date on a first date? He better not." And I remember thinking, what's wrong with the Cheesecake Factory? Like, they're like, this is the first date. This person, you may hate this person, they may hate you, or you might not hate, you just may not click. So why you want the person to just take you to some like fancy rooftop restaurant and spend like thousands of dollars to take you to eat when you may not ever call them again or whatever? Like, it was just like this expectation that people have to have this impressive, you know, level of whatever just for a simple outing, And so I'm thinking about in our community when there's a lot of economic, disparities, when people might be interdependent on, like relatives or caregivers or roommates, or might, for various reasons, driving might be a challenge or whatever. So we might not, an autistic adult person or, teen or adult might not look like the traditional dating partner. They might not have, some of these qualities, that are contrived as being seen as um, attractive, and necessary. Or they might not have like the cool way of like, communicating or flirting, in a certain way. And so those things can also And that thing that can be something that could be a challenge that anyone can have. But if you're expected to be the one that's savvy when it comes to dating and supposed to take the lead and supposed to pay and supposed to arrange the outing and like woo the other person, if that pressure is on you, that can be hard. Whereas the other person might have those challenges, but it might be okay because, okay, she's just quiet, or oh, she's just kind of awkward, but she's cute. Or, maybe it doesn't matter that she doesn't drive because you're expected to pick her up. Or maybe it doesn't matter that she doesn't really have a job right now because you're paying. You know what I mean? So some of those things that, again, could be a challenge for anyone would be more so for, autistic men, when we think about like traditional Western standards of dating.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. And one thing that I think might be somewhat related to this is the I think sometimes we can become very granular about what it means to um, I guess share tasks and responsibilities equally across a relationship. So in particular, like I guess in the concept of straight relationships, especially if people are living together, I know that unfortunately it is still the case where women are often expected to do a lot of a lot of like childcare to the point where I mean there have been times where men have been referred to as like babysitting their own child,
Yes.
especially in the past. But I think that sometimes in a reaction to that, there can be this idea that if there is like one specific aspect of uh, household maintenance or something that a man isn't able to do, that it's automatically related to entitlement. Um, And
Mm,
in some cases, it could be a daily living skills thing. Of course, if the person's just like happily shoveling all responsibilities for everything onto the partner, that's a totally different story. But I think that someone being unable to do like one specific type of chore or something shouldn't necessarily be perceived as some kind of malicious incompetence. Even though I have kind of the other side of that that I'll get to in the next question. But uh, yeah, that's kind of one side of it. The next question is so um, having kind of prefaced this with our initial couple questions, I know that there is misogyny and sexism in the world, and autistic men aren't these, perfect angels that are exempt from it, unfortunately. So, what are there ways in which autism is sometimes used to cover up misogyny, or ways in which autism can somehow be relevant to the way in which one develops misogyny?
yes. But aside from just yes, I'm like, that's an emphatic yes. Not even just misogyny, I'd say like other challenging behaviors too. Like, um, if we just, think back, some days to a very interesting quote unquote salute that was made. If I read one more thing where someone tries to say, oh, Elon Musk is autistic, he didn't understand that's what it was mean. It was just an awkward movement. No, 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 no. I've been autistic my whole life, and I don't go around making like those types of gestures. I'm sorry, no. But people would almost rather blame it on the autism and then him being an autistic male than to realize that someone is literally playing in our faces and doing something that's wrong. Like if you watch the clip, there are other places where you do see him engaging in kind of like autistic gestures or some of our, like I guess, what non-autistic people would consider unconventional types of movements or whatever, but that was not one of them. And so I think that people will excuse away, things that are dangerous or problematic, you know, because of autism. And yes, autism is a disability, but it doesn't mean that we're incapable um, of any understanding or of like making improvements or of also like being jerks. you know
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that sometimes um, it's almost assumed that autistic people aren't capable of having harmful beliefs or actions, and that can lead to people not being challenged even if they are doing something that's really unhealthy. Okay, so the next thing that I wrote here is a little hard to phrase precisely. It's almost the flip side of what we talked about earlier, where sometimes autistic people, do approach things in a more methodical way and explain things step by step. Um, and I think a lot of times that's just genuinely part of someone's communication. But I do think that even autistic traits, just like any trait, they can be used in a negative way depending on the situation. So, like, people can, even autistic people who often explain things in detail, can still, maybe even unintentionally, explain things in a more condescending way,
Hmm.
um, due to maybe subconscious bias. Even if
Hmm.
someone is, uh, struggles a little bit with interrupting from time to time, there's always a possibility that they're interrupting people more often, probably not intentionally. They're probably not like consciously going, I'm going to now interrupt this person 2.5 times more than someone else. But it's still, I think the other person's identity, and in some cases maybe gender dynamics, can influence some of these things. And um, I guess my personal perspective is that even if it's like the impact versus intention debate, I guess, in some ways, where
Hmm.
if you interrupt someone, or if I interrupt someone and they feel hurt by it, I don't know if I would necessarily start explaining that I interrupt everyone at an equivalent rate, even if I knew for sure that that was true. You know, like, I think that sometimes autistic traits, the fact that they're autistic, connected to autism, can almost be viewed as a sort of immunity against experiencing the
Mm.
repercussions of the actions, even if the actions themselves weren't malicious and people shouldn't necessarily feel ashamed of their communication style. Um, and in some like extreme instances, and I think we discussed this a little bit in one of our earlier videos, I think it's theoretically possible that um, even if I don't think it's that common, but autism and mental health, I think, can actually be more intentionally weaponized against people. So
And maybe it would be helpful if we could kind of share that if anyone was interested in taking a look at some of those examples. Um, but and so I also think that I know another thing that we had talked about is that people may be unaware of, another element of this is that people might not realize the privilege that they have, even being, autistic, even being disabled, like there is still, being male brings its privileges. Like it is, like we see this just even in, like, with diagnostic, rates, so forth. If a person who's, assigned male at birth, or, is more likely to, receive their diagnosis earlier. People are, for a long time, autism was equated to, being male, lighted up blue, and so forth. So, there is a lot of, it seems like there's been a lot of attack on, like, the autistic community in terms of who's quote unquote really autistic or not. And a lot of that seems, there seems to be a heavy gender bias with that. Whereas, I seldom I see that with, more, like non-binary, or, or female or femme, individuals, seem to be, their diagnoses seem to be questioned a lot more, than, than those who are males, autistic men.
yeah, that's a really good point. The next question is, I think we decided that this one isn't actually a question. It's more something that maybe we're hoping to discuss in a future video.
Yeah.
But I'll just read it so people know that it's topics that we're interested in. And then if you have anything that you want to add, I'd love to hear that as well. But probably the broader discussion of it will hold for the future. So the questions are, is there such a thing as quote unquote too much anti-man sentiment, or does anti-man sentiment exist in certain progressive spaces? If so, is it okay for men to feel hurt by it? And how can men figure out when they're being defensive, um, versus when a feeling of being hurt isn't necessarily coming from defensiveness? Um, so, do you have anything else that you want to add on that now before I jump to the next question?
just for everyone to stay tuned for that to be a future video, because we're not by any means suggesting the extreme where some people are stating that men are so discriminated against and
No.
are having everything taken away from them. Like, we're not, that is not what we're getting at all, but we're just taking an honest look at a lot of progressive communities, and how um, things there can be a lot of generalizations made, and you know I think lack of recognition of the individuality of people, and that um there are just intersectionality has so many layers that I think sometimes people paint use a very broad paintbrush to depict a group that is not a monolith. And I think that it's something that definitely needs to be explored.
Yes, I really appreciate that clarification. Yes, I don't want it to seem like we're going to start setting up a men's rights activism channel or something like that. We're more talking about kind of niche
Yes.
cases. Yeah, so the next question is, what resources would you like to see made available to autistic men to yeah, to both kind of provide support and mental health resources, and to potentially reduce the instances where autistic men maybe do fall into more harmful attitudes. And I also want to kind of, as a disclaimer, because I don't know if I made this clear in the video so far, I don't think we're trying to imply that autistic men are more misogynistic than non-autistic men. I don't
No, we're not.
actually think that's the case at all. I mean, we're autistic, so that's why we're talking about men specifically.
Yes. We know that unfortunately you can find misogynists in every group. But I guess so, like, when I think about resources, um, and role models, I guess I try to think about what I wish existed, and what seems not to be. And so one thing that comes to mind immediately, like, so when I think about like the um and I think nobody's mentioned this before, but I guess like when I think about when like look up autistic, I don't know, public figures or autistic whatever, like there'll be these top 10 or top 100 lists of autistic people, and I so seldom see males of color. You know what I mean? And there are definitely some. I know that we have colleagues like Hari Srinivasan and some others who are so fortunately there are some, but I don't really feel like there are a whole lot. And Stephen Shore is great. Stephen Cap is great. All these people, but Dave Caudell, like a number of people who I respect and admire. But I'd love for my son to see somebody who looks like him, or um, it, um, and so I'd love for there to be more of, I guess, visibly, racialized autistic people, and to build on that, who are not necessarily quote unquote passing. And I'm not saying any of those individuals are passing. That's not what I'm trying to imply. But what I'm saying is that I think that um, I want it to be okay to see somebody that, like, if, for example, if someone looks at um, if you observe, Michael J. Fox, he's visibly disabled, or like different people, Imani Barbarin or whatever. I guess I want it. I know it's not always safe or feasible, and I know everyone stems differently, and more external stems are not better than more internal stems. But someone who kind of flaps or rocks, or scripts noticeably, or averts their gaze at times, or whatever. I'd love for that, for someone who um, is, I guess, um, I guess observably disabled, to be able to be acknowledged or celebrated, in their own skin. Like, I can't think of anybody like that really that I could point, like they're either, and I feel like we need those voices, and I think they exist. But I guess, that's why, I'm glad we have projects like, like the Neurodiversity of Color Project and so on, where maybe we can try to, um, it'll be easier for people to find, those individuals.
Yeah. Um, Definitely. I wish that there were more resources for autistic fathers. I think just in general, parents,
Mm.
autistic or not, regardless of gender, could probably benefit from more support. Um, but I think that would be a neat type of resource. And maybe something to combat the feeling of isolation that I think a lot of autistic people experience, and that very anecdotally, I've never done a research study on this, but I conjecture that sense of isolation um, seems to be like maybe a little bit more pronounced among men. I
Mm.
think a resource could be helpful there as well. And then the last question is, so I know we were talking like previously, for example, about diagnostic disparities that often autistic women are often diagnosed much later in life. Is there anything else kind of along those lines that you wish more um, because I do often find that like when gender or other factors are brought up, diagnostic disparities are often the first point of conversation,
Yes,
and I think
they
it's
are.
really important. Like that's always what I include in presentation as well. But I imagine that that's not the only issue that people are ever facing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on if there's anything.
Sure. I mean, I think obviously that's an important issue because that, it impacts access to services and, self-awareness and so many things. But I wish also that I feel like maybe it's not intentional, but I feel like the, it seems that like, so I noticed that there's been like efforts to, be more gender inclusive of, and so, but it seems like they almost, in some cases, it's like um, like non-binary individuals as quote unquote women light when that's not the case. You know what I mean? It's like, and it's kind of like there's a meme that I saw where someone was saying, as a person of color, do you? And the person said, no, I'm black. They said, but I mean, as a person of color, she said, no, I'm black. Lickety black, black, and it was a joke, but it's kind of that some people feel like there, have been some people who believe that the term person of color simply means black when it's supposed to, it's a range of individuals that it refers to, but sometimes it's used as a euphemism for that. And so I think that sometimes people just throw things together, and essentially, there's still unique elements to all of these groups, you know, respective of one another. So that's one thing I guess that would be great. Another is I think it would be nice to just um I think there need to be I don't feel like there's enough other than like maybe statistics. I don't think a lot like how the um, intersection between like like the criminal justice system, the legal system, and autism and gender, and how that, you know, how it impacts people's outcomes and, like trauma and um, the way some of our groups are socialized and like employment. I think all of these conversations have, um, there are, you know, there are components that, gender plays a huge role in that I think don't get addressed. Like, when, there are these, like neurodiversity in the workplace, or research or whatever programs and like these discussions. And I feel like they often don't take into account that other very important piece that can impact your earning potential, can impact the way you interact with the individuals around you and how and what the ramifications are for you. And so I guess I wish that we broaden those conversations, and because they we can't use like the same template for everyone. Like some of the conversations that people have about like the workplace and asking for what you want, like like these like this assertiveness that um might be more inherently natural or accessible to an autistic man that might not be to another person in that same setting, or how they'll be perceived if they take that same approach. Just kind of conversations like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, thank you again for your time and for collaborating on this video. Um, is there anything that I'm forgetting to ask on this topic before we close?
Mm. Oh, yes. Well, it's not forgetting, but I guess one thing that I'd really love to say is that, so I know that people are starting to make more like sensory friendly, like clothing, right? And so that's something I'd love to see is like, to me, I'd love the input from, like autistic men about some of these clothing lines, because I feel like clothing that's like quote unquote female, it's not unisex, tends to already have a lot of problems, even if you take away the sensory aspect. Not enough pockets, or pockets that aren't deep enough, or waistlines that are weird. So I feel like this is an advantage that maybe autistic men have, like to can give some pointers to these designers and to these people about what works and how to design these clothing in a way that's sensory friendly and yet can be durable, that can, something that a person can utilize for work, but also maybe for socialization, so you can be comfortable but still look good. I think that I don't see, you know, much. I mean, I don't know, maybe I'm just not aware of it, but there doesn't seem to be many people seeking the voices of autistic men when it comes to like fashion and psychology, or, you know, sustainable, fashion or anything like that. And I feel like that it's a missing voice. And I feel like what better group to, you know what I mean, to give us some good input, um, you know, than that group.
Yeah, that is a really interesting point. I have about the fashion sense of a potato, so I never would have thought of that topic, but it does make sense that it could benefit from input from people buying every type of clothing.
Yes,
Yeah, well, awesome. Thank you so much again.
for sure.